Parallel versus series. Do you know what it means? Today we're going to talk about that, and later in the video I'll show you specific examples of how I use both in my mixes. But first, a quick story. I sent an email out to my email newsletter about compression, specifically a type of compression I like to use where I use two compressors, and the second compressor is what I call a butter compressor, and it kind of glues everything together. It's lovely. We'll talk about that another day here on YouTube. But somebody replied to that email and said, hey, where specifically does that second compressor go? And I said it goes at the end of the chain. And he wrote back and said, cool, so it's parallel compression. Thanks a lot, appreciate it. And I said, hold up, slow down, Turbo. That's not parallel compression. That's the opposite of parallel compression. It made me think we have a lot of jargon in the audio world. And while I don't love jargon for jargon's sake, there is a certain amount of vocabulary that you've got to learn if you want any hope of getting good at this. If you don't understand certain important words, certain important vocabulary words, then when someone teaches you a concept, you're going to go do it the wrong way because you didn't actually understand that core concept. So that's what we're going to talk about today. What exactly is parallel compression, and how does it relate to, or what exactly is just parallel processing, or just the word parallel in general, because there's lots of different ways that we use parallel processing, not just parallel compression, by the way. And then I'll give you specific examples of how that works. So this is a bit of an audio 101 episode. And if you're new around here, my name's Joe, and I'm a big fan of simplicity. There's enough complicated stuff out there. Let's make our music production process simple. There's a lot to learn. There are vocabulary words to know, but I only want you to know the ones that matter and the ones that actually make a difference. And you could ignore the other 80% of information and knowledge and advice out there and just follow a very simple process. If you want an example of a simple process that I teach, I've got a 5-step mix guide that'll blow your mind. Super simple and super powerful and super free. Just go to 5stepmix.com to get your free copy today. Uncle Joe got some new markers, so let's play as we go through this concept. So let's talk about the difference between parallel and series or serial. Not bowl of cereal, but like S-E-R-I-A-L. Serial, or we could call this series. Now, these terms come from like electronics and wiring and things like that. We're not going to get super technical. We're going to talk about just the simplicity of it because that's all that we use for what we do in audio. So it's all about signal flow, where the signal goes from one place to the next. Signal in an analog mixer, it travels down a wire, okay? And it's going in a specific direction. So this signal is going in one direction. Parallel processing is when you take that signal and you basically have two copies of the signal, both moving in the same direction, and they're independent of one another. This requires some sort of a splitter of sorts. Now, it's not always called a splitter, but you can't have parallel unless you have some sort of device that takes the existing signal and splits it into two or more, and then those two or more become kind of independent pieces of audio. And eventually, sometimes, those two will come back together and reunite. So you'll need kind of the opposite of the splitter here. This is usually what we call like a bus over here to unite them back into a single piece of audio. But the parallel part is this part in the middle, when it splits and you can do things to each signal separately, okay? Serial, I'm hungry just thinking about it. Serial has to do with taking two different devices, let's say, and putting them one after the other. This is like normal workflow. You put a compressor here and another compressor there. You feed the signal into this one first, and then it comes after. It is a series of processes, one after the other. A great example, if you play guitar, it's really easy to visualize this. So an example of parallel would be, let's say we've got a couple of guitar pedals, and these are going to look like cute little robots. All right. And let's say we want to run our guitar through these. Let's use blue for serial, because serial is the normal way that this works. So we've got our guitar. We'll go right to left, because that's actually, we'll go left to right. Right to left is how guitar pedals work, but don't worry about that. So you have your guitar over here. It's beautiful. And we got signal coming in. And the signal comes into one pedal, gets processed and messed around with. Then that processed signal comes out, goes into the next pedal, and then that signal comes out and goes over here, wherever it's going to go, typically to some sort of a beautiful guitar amplifier of sorts, right? That looks like a washing machine, but you get the idea. That is, the blue is serial. Serial for blue. Now parallel will do red. Red for parallel. To use the same pedals, parallel would look like this. We've got the guitar. The signal goes into some sort of a splitter box. And then the splitter box has two different outputs. So it sends it out through one pedal and sends this out through the other pedal. And then typically you could either run these to two different guitar amps, or you have another box that joins them all back together into one, and then that's what feeds the guitar amp. So when we do this, whatever I do on this pedal doesn't affect this pedal at all, and vice versa. I can do anything I want on these. They're independent of each other because they're in parallel. The signal, it looks just like this. These two pedals are plopped over here on this little diagram there, and then they're getting put back together. That is the definition of parallel and serial. Serial is one after another. Parallel is you have to have some sort of split. The signal has to be split, and then it goes through two different pathways before either going to two different destinations or joining back together. Let me show you what that looks like in an actual mix session in Studio One. So serial mixing is the way I spend 90% of my time, probably closer to like 95. Here's a vocal track. This is where I say things like I put a compressor on, then I put an EQ, and then I might use a de-esser, and then I might even get crazy and put a second compressor on there. These plugins that we see here are going in order one at a time. The signal comes into the compressor first, then the EQ, then the de-esser, then the compressor. We can change the order. We might find that maybe we want to de-ess first, or maybe the vocal needs some EQ before we do any compressing. There are several ways we can do this, and there are reasons to do each of them, because how we EQ it will change how the compressor works. If we compress first, then the EQ is coming after the compressor, so the compressor will affect how the EQ works and vice versa. It's all happening in series. This one then gives way to this one. The only exception, in the place where people maybe get confused, is if you were to put something like a reverb plugin on the channel, you could use this mix knob, which is what guitar players do to get around this. All the way to the left gives us the dry signal. All the way to the right gives us a completely what we call wet signal, which is all the reverb, and then somewhere in between. You know what this is doing? This is a splitter built into the reverb that splits the signal dry and wet. This isn't actually how I recommend using reverb, and that's what I'm going to show you is the first example of parallel processing that you probably didn't think about, is to use a send to send your track to a reverb. This is the way, one of the very first videos I made on this channel 15 years ago was how to set up a reverb send. It was in Pro Tools back then, but it's the same concept. You send from this channel to this reverb channel that we've created. So without it, the vocal sounds like this.
You're running from your shadow.
And then we send it.
You're running from your shadow.
Now there beeth reverb. And what's happening here is this is the splitter that we talked about in the diagram. This is taking a copy of the signal and then sending however much or however little we want over to this channel. So now our vocal is in two places. Our vocal shows up here, the dry vocal. We still hear the dry vocal completely, and then we're also hearing a copy of the vocal hitting this compressor. And then those two independent channels of the vocal running in parallel are going to combine together at our mix bus and eventually create our final vocal sound. That's parallel processing. Let me show you a more common example. When people say parallel processing, they're usually talking about something like this. Here's a drum kit, and with no plugins on there, it sounds like this. And what some people might want to do is run, they call it New York compression or parallel compression, where you put a compressor on here, but you actually listen to the dry signal blended with the compressed signal. Now there's lots of ways to do this. Studio One actually gives us this ability using a splitter tool. So we can put a splitter before the compressor, and let me make this a little bigger, and then put the compressor on one side. And what's basically happening is now the signal, remember that splitter I talked about? The signal's going through here and going through here. It's all happening on the same channel. So we're going to hear the dry signal on this side and the compressed signal on this side. So first, let's dial in our compressed signal. We're going to make it just obnoxious so you can hear what's happening. Let's go like super fast attack and release. This should sound terrible. over the top, terrible, not a good sound, but it demonstrates our point. With the splitter now, we can combine the two. So if we turn this one all the way down, we'll hear just the dry drums, and as I turn this one up, you'll hear it combine the compressed sound with the dry sound. So remember how terrible that compressor sounded by itself? Blended with just the dry drums, it's a little bit better. It's like having a mix knob on a compressor, but we're able to control it completely, exactly how much of the compressed signal we want, exactly how much of the dry signal we want, and we can blend the two together. Now, historically, you'll find tutorials that'll show you how to do this on multiple channels in your DAW, multiple faders. There are pros and cons to that. Studio One lets you do it with this splitter, which I think is handy, if nothing else, than for teaching and visualizing what's happening. We've split the signal literally, and now we're compressing one and not compressing the other and blending those two sounds together. You can get crazy with this, but this is the most common example of parallel processing. Final piece of bonus advice. Can I tell you a secret? I almost never do parallel processing, or specifically parallel compression. Is it because it's bad? No, it's because I adore simplicity, and you should too. If you find yourself doing really complicated things because they make sense on paper, but they don't actually sound all that much better to you, get rid of it. Let go of all the complicated mixing solutions you found and embrace a simple way of life. If you can't make it work with a simple EQ and a compressor, there are other problems at play. And you got to go solve those problems before your mixes will ever sound good. It is the more difficult path in a lot of ways, but it's the actual path to actually getting really good at this. Embrace simplicity. Go as complicated as you need to and no more. I opt for the simplest approach, and it has served me well over the last 20 years. I encourage you to do the same. All right, that's it for me. Hopefully you enjoyed this. If you're not subscribed yet, click the button over here and be sure you subscribe. If you want more mixing tips from me, here's 19 tips. I just hit my keyboard. Here's 19 tips that I wish I'd learned a long time ago. Thanks for watching. See ya.